Thank you, Andy. A team of us in ODI have been doing some thinking about whether it's important to work with governments to help address sector governance constraints to public service delivery. So in this presentation, I'm going to present some emerging findings from the research we're doing, which examines whether there are ways aid packages can be designed and implemented that enable them to best address these sector governance constraints. Obviously, exploring whether aid can or should influence governance in countries is not a new idea. Development practitioners have been grappling with these issues for a long time. It's because it's a particularly difficult subject. We're not expecting to provide a silver bullet. I know that was mentioned a lot in the last session, and I don't think we're expecting to provide that, but hopefully we'll offer some interesting ideas for those that are involved in actually designing and implementing aid packages. As Andy mentioned, we're in the pre-synthesis phase, so I'm going to use this presentation to actually explain the rationale of our research, talk you through the governance constraints we're looking at, and explain some of our emerging findings, particularly related to what sort of activities can possibly address these sector governance constraints, and also what conditions are necessary for these activities to get traction. So how did we get to this question? The motivation for this research came from two different but interrelated directions. Last year we carried out a meeting series on budget support, which examined the evidence of the effect of that modality to date. This instrument seems to represent our best guess at aid effectiveness, but lots of questions remain unanswered about its impact. In particular, a sector budget support review was carried out by ODI a couple of years ago that showed that operations are often not able to address downstream governance constraints, or put another way, they're not able to leverage changes in the incentives faced by those delivering services on the front line, i.e. health workers, teachers, etc. So this suggests that perhaps the way we're currently distinguishing aid modalities, according to the arrangements concerning the management and disbursement of funds, e.g. whether money uses country systems, whether it's earmarked, whether it's traceable, is perhaps not adequate to actually deliver all the results we need in development. In addition, we're also building on a growing body of evidence that has existed for a while now that emphasise the importance of getting the right institutions and governance in place in a sector to deliver adequate public services. And the WDR report 2004 emphasised that. So we wanted to see if there was a way of combining the two literatures, if there are ways that aid modalities can be designed and implemented that enable them to best address these governance constraints. So first, what constraints are we talking about? The politics and governance team within ODI have been doing some work on diagnosing sector governance constraints, and we've taken three of the constraints they've diagnosed, and we're particularly interested in policy and institutional incoherence, and that relates to whether mandates are clear and unduplicated, whether policy and resource frameworks are in conflict or aligned. Secondly, the degree of performance disciplines in a system, and we're interested in top-down and bottom-up accountability mechanisms. And thirdly, the space for local problem-solving, collective action solutions, and this directly builds on some of the work David has been doing, as mentioned earlier. We are very aware that the wider political and governance conditions in a country shapes the form of these constraints in practice. However, we did want to look at the things we thought aid would be able to implement in an incremental way, or influence it, albeit in an incremental way. So we are looking, let's say, at the wider politics and governance in a country in our research, but we're not taking it as a separate constraint that we're thinking aid will be able to influence. Okay, so the process so far. We decided that in order to examine the right sorts of aid packages, we would need to look at those that were considered to have addressed the constraints we're interested in. So we interviewed about 20 aid effectiveness and governance experts. to give us ideas of aid packages. Perhaps the first illuminating finding is that many of these experts struggle to think of examples of aid packages that had been able to address these constraints. However, we got a longish list from which we decided we would look at 5 aid packages in more depth. And those are on the slide. First, we're looking at Crossroads in Uganda. Second, the AGI, Africa Governance Initiative in Sierra Leone. Third, the Local Government Development Programme in Uganda. Fourth, an SNV-funded water point functionality programme in Tanzania. And fifth, a budget support programme in Sierra Leone that ties funding to health worker attendance. 2 points are important to raise at this stage. The countries we're looking at are all LICs, and one is a fragile state. So they do have a subset of development needs that might be quite different to many other developing countries. Second, the programs themselves are very different. They have very different intervention logics. They're trying to address these governance constraints in very different ways. So obviously trying to pull out key themes across these programs is not the easiest task. First, before we started looking at the influence of these aid packages, we wanted to understand what the conditions in the country were prior to intervention. So we were particularly interested in the extent of the blockage in the country before the aid package started. As you can see on this slide, we've got all the 5 programs we're looking at and the 3 governance constraints. Red means particularly poor governance or high governance challenge, let's say. So if we look at the African Governance Initiative in Sierra Leone, it was suggested that there was particular policy and institutional incoherence, and that was quite high prior to intervention. Whereas green actually looks like the constraint is not so much of a problem. We can see there's a certain amount of consistency actually across all the conditions. So for example, we see that poor performance discipline seemed to be a problem across many of the programs prior to intervention or countries prior to intervention, whereas there's a fair amount of space for local problem solving. The first sort of emerging finding we are particularly interested in relates to the types of activities that have been able to address these governance constraints. Now, I appreciate this slide is very difficult to read, so I'm just going to take you through one of the programs, and that's the Local Government Development Programme in Uganda, and we're particularly interested in the earlier phase. So this programme provided grants to districts for local level infrastructure. In the programme, we can see that coherence was strengthened because one of the objectives of the grant was to actually support the implementation of constitutional and legal mandates for decentralisation. It did this by tying the grant allocation to the performance of the district, particularly related to financial management. So, for example, were there accountants in place? Were they producing budgets? Was there a planning process, etc.? And the higher the performance of the district, the larger amount of grant allocated. So actually we see some sort of top-down level performance discipline instilled at the same time. In addition, local problem solving was encouraged because there was a participatory planning process at the local level. So, and that went from district to the sub-county to the parish to the village, and they were all involved in planning for the allocation of this discretionary infrastructure fund. So we've looked across all the programs to see if there are any common activities that we can pull out. And at the moment, you know, we'll just show you this slide and go on to conditions, but that's something we'll be expanding later. So the next thing we're particularly interested in is actually what conditions enable these activities to get traction. And the first thing we found, which is probably quite apparent to most people that have been doing any work in development for a while, is that political prioritization was key. In all the countries, political prioritization for the sector emerged prior to intervention. The donors were able to take advantage of that window of opportunity and work with the countries effectively to help implement the programme. But as the political prioritization for the the sector diminished, so did the performance of the programme against its own objectives and also its ability to influence the governance constraints. The second thing we found was actually about the ability of the aid package to, or the aid programme, to adapt based on analysis that informed its programming. More recently, there seems to have been the rumblings of a revival of older thinking that process approaches are important for facilitating results. Pritchett and Andrews have written about problem-driven iterative adaptation. And so we found two important things here. Firstly, there was a prioritisation of analysis by the donors involved in implementing the programme throughout the implementation of the programme itself. And this remained a relatively constant, let me start again. The prioritisation of analysis to facilitate problem solving remained a relatively constant feature throughout the programme. So if we take the example of SNV, the Water Point Functionality Programme in Tanzania, a power analysis was carried out every 2 years, and this actually informed the activities that were going to be carried out in the programme. So there was a constant feedback loop between what was able to work and what wasn't necessarily working, and this changed the design of the programme during implementation. In addition, prior to implementation, we found that all the programmes involved extensive donor diagnostic work to actually analyse what the real problems were and what the best way to address them were going to be. And this involved both sector technical analysis and political economy analysis on behalf of the donor. So we see in a number of the programmes that the interventions were regularly being updated to take into account for such analysis, so that donors were able to nudge forward institutional change in what is often a very complex environment. And the third condition we thought was important was what we're calling facilitating implementation in a smart way. Now, we actually spoke to Lamp Pritchett this morning, and he said smart was a really naff title. So we need to obviously change that. But, and Simon Maxwell's shaking his head. But I think there are three things that are coming out. Now, we do need to unpack this a lot more. These really are just emerging findings. But the first thing relates to the fact that all the aid packages provided operational support or coaching. And this is important for two reasons. First of all, they very rarely were attached to policy dialogue. And where policy dialogue was in place, it wasn't necessarily very effective. And secondly, this provision of operational support and coaching actually created the space for local problem solving. So actors were able to come together to discuss and cooperate and find their own solutions. So for example, if we look at the AGI in Sierra Leone, it facilitates a stock-taking process where ministry officials come together to jointly programme activities on a monthly basis. In addition, the local government development programmes I mentioned earlier encouraged participatory planning processes which brought individuals at the local level together. So donors are very much through their aid packages facilitating and providing coaching. They're not trying to be the principal, let's say, in this approach. We also noted that objectives of the aid programmes were related to releasing specific blockages, but these objectives were in the context of a strong goal for service delivery, and that's quite clear with the AGI, for example, in Sierra Leone. And then finally, we noticed that all the programmes were focusing on strengthening government delivery systems, but they didn't necessarily use them in the way that we traditionally understand the word in development. So, for example, they didn't all involve the transfer of funds, but they were focused on strengthening the mechanics of the system, either through coaching people on their roles and responsibilities, providing support for the implementation of a monitoring system or helping develop a monitoring system. They weren't in any way trying to bypass these systems, supporting the creation of delivery mechanisms outside the system, but they were all aiming to strengthen the system. So, to conclude, we would be very keen to hear your thoughts on this work. We appreciate this is just the first step in thinking about aid modalities in a slightly different way, and not just thinking about the arrangements concerning the management and disbursement of funds, and actually thinking about whether they can be designed and implemented in a way that enables them to actually support strengthening of these specific governance or addressing these specific governance constraints. We're also interested to hear a wider perspective, because obviously we've just focused on 5 programmes, but we hope this gives you a flavour into what potential activities could address these governance constraints, when this can be done, for example, when a window of opportunity reveals itself, and how a donor can develop a programme that might be best able to address these constraints, for example, if it's particularly adaptive and help support implementation in a slightly different way.
Thanks very much, Heidi.